Relationships in work. Consider when you feel that someone has not behaved rightly toward you, feeling you have not been estimated at your proper value. For example, to feel slighted or insulted is to feel that you are not estimated at your proper value. So people often say when insulted, "Do you know who I am?" or something along those lines. They mean that they have an esteemed valuation of themselves, and therefore demand recognition, meaning others may not be aware of this estimation, as if they did, they would not dare to behave as they do. Of course, if we have little or no picture of ourselves as being valuable, then we will not so easily be upset. A high estimation of oneself naturally makes us more vulnerable in feeling that others do not assess us at our proper value. Hence we internally consider more easily. A person may even be so preoccupied with the question of people treating them rightly, with suspicions about whether others may be subjecting them to ridicule, that their whole life could be said to be absorbed with internal considering. Some may even value themselves above others, because of sufferings, which they wear proudly like a medal. People cling to their own suffering, then come to regard themselves as worthy of special evaluation, because they have had all kinds of hardships, miseries, and sufferings. They are offended if another person begins to talk of their own suffering, feeling that others do not consider them enough, and are therefore selfish. It is difficult for people such as this to realize that everyone has sufferings of their own. Nor do they realize that to see selfishness in others is to see the reflection of one's own selfishness, for the more demands that we make of others, the more selfish will others appear to us. What is it then that causes one to begin to internally consider? Let's ask the question, at what point, or where, do we start making accounts? We start when we feel that we are not held in a high enough estimation, when we feel that we are undervalued. The waiter does not come when called. The shop assistant serves another person first. Perhaps people do not look at us enough in the street, or let us say, pay sufficient attention to us in general. Maybe one person seems persistently to ignore us, or overlook our contribution. Perhaps we overhear what someone said of us, which is nearly always unpleasant. There are 1,001 possible examples, less and more serious. Small incidents upset us easily: the server, the other driver, fast food, the customer service representative. These form short accounts, and may eventually become a habit, then we start demanding to speak to the manager. But we have all sorts of long-standing accounts against others, some of them stored up in the past, unfortunately for ourselves. They all begin with this mysterious question of one's valuation of oneself. A person with some self-observation might well exclaim, "What is this thing in me that is offended in the moment, and has already begun to make accounts? Look, I can observe it at work in me, collecting materials and beginning to remember unpleasant things, then to find words and phrases to use against the other person, so as to make them feel that they are also underestimated by me. In fact, to make them realize they are only so much dirt. Is it a picture of myself? Is it imaginary I? Is it false personality? Or what is it that lies at the bottom of it all?" The answer to what is at the bottom of it all is where we identify with ourselves. All forms of internal considering, of which making accounts against another person is but one form, belong to identifying. The work says that we must study identifying, down to its very roots. Someone is only offended where they are identified with themselves. The work also points out that the study of identifying must begin with a study of where we are identified with ourselves. It is here that our triggers lie, where we can be upset, hurt, offended, and insulted. The being identified with oneself comes first, being upset and offended comes second, making inner accounts comes third. Some people find it difficult to understand what external considering means, and others to understand what internal considering means. In this work, external considering must be done, and internal considering stopped. To externally consider another person, it is first necessary to put yourself in the other's position. To do this, we must think of ourselves as being this other person, having to do the same things, having the same difficulties, the same handicaps, and living the same life. If we can begin to think of this preliminary step, we can hardly say that external considering has anything to do with being indifferent. To put yourself in another person's situation calls upon your whole understanding. It requires a directed effort of the mind and feelings, not merely once, but time and again. Obviously, we would be incapable of doing this if we were always preoccupied with our own personal problems and woes, with the way we are being treated. If we are always taking our life from the standpoint of internal considering. Such is the case of someone who is always internally considering, always suffering, someone who wrote on their spouse's tombstone, "From your heartbroken partner." Even then, they could only think of themselves, of their own suffering. If we could begin to externally consider another person over a considerable period, then we would again and again put ourselves in the other person's position, and in this way become more conscious. The object of this work is to become more conscious. Self-observation makes us more conscious of ourselves, external considering makes us more conscious of others. Through externally considering, things that we were not conscious of before are revealed to us. Take by example putting ourselves in another's position, then after a time realizing that we expect that person to do things that we would not think of doing ourselves. Perhaps expect someone to put up with conditions that we would not put up with for an instant. Do you see what has been gained in consciousness? If we have a revelation of this kind, it means that we are really beginning to externally consider, to understand what it means to put ourselves in another person's position. People who make a great many requirements expect a great deal from others, and if they do not get what they expect, they are disappointed, then feel that they are owed. That is, they begin to add a great background of internal considering to their lives. This makes them bitter, as they feel they have many scores to settle. For a person of this kind to externally consider becomes very difficult. But it should not be so difficult unless we have become crystallized. To realize that we expect the other person to do things that we would never think of doing ourselves, makes a very powerful starting point from which to begin externally considering others. It is a practical starting point and a work starting point. We realize then that we expect the other person not only to do things that we would never think of doing, but to be different from us, to behave differently, put up with things differently and so on. Let's suppose that we have always compared ourselves very favorably with other people, and perhaps are even sure that none of the unpleasant things we notice in others exist in ourselves. It will be very surprising then, to have the revelation that we are unjust, and that we expect others in the work to do what we would not dream of doing ourselves. It's always painful to realize that there is actually anything wrong with oneself. As pointed out previously, we may often say that we are to blame for something, but if someone actually agrees with us, it is startling, and we feel offended. Yes, we easily pretend we are wrong, but to see it, direct and unmistakable in oneself is painful. This is real, and so useful suffering, for all real suffering purifies the emotions. It only lasts a brief time however as real suffering, and then becomes infected with false personality, changing into some complicated negative state, some sort of unpleasant self-pity, or endless self-justifying which is useless suffering. Suppose though, that we have to live with a person called ourselves. I once read a story of a man who died and went into the next world, where he met numbers of people, some of whom he knew and liked, then some he knew and disliked. But there was one particular person there whom he did not know and could not bear to be near. Everything they said infuriated and disgusted him. Their manner, their habits, their laziness, their insincere way of speaking, their tone and facial expressions. It seemed to him also that he could see into this man's thoughts, his feelings, all his secrets, and in fact, into all of his life. He asked the others who this impossible man was. They answered, "Up here we have very special mirrors which are quite different from those in your world. This man is yourself." Let us suppose then, that you have to live with a person who is you. Perhaps this is what the other person has to do. Of course, if you have no self-observation, then you may actually imagine this would be quite charming, and that if everyone were just like you, the world would indeed be a happier place. There are no limits to our vanity and self-conceit. In putting ourselves into another person's position, we are also putting ourselves into their point of view, into how they see us, hear us, and experience us through our daily behavior. We are literally seeing ourselves through their eyes. If we have no self-observation, we cannot do this, because we will simply take ourselves for granted, as being quite all right in everything. But if we have become sufficiently trained in self-observation, to have begun to lose our former ideas of ourselves, and if we already have a collection, not only of snapshots, but of cabinet-size photographs of ourselves in our most typical roles, the case will be quite different. We will be able to see ourselves to some extent as other people see us, and so begin to realize practically what the other person's situation is, and what some of their difficulties are, what it might mean if we had to live with ourselves. Of course, the other person must do the same. Some may think on hearing this, that it is quite right to say that the other person should try to see how difficult he or she is. But notice that we are beginning the other way around. It is we who have to see how difficult we are for the other person. All this is not easy to grasp, and we may feel that we have heard it already, but a lifetime at least is needed to see all that it implies. In the work, relationship is important. Work relationship is impossible without external considering. In general, we must approach one another through the medium of this work. The work and its teaching must lie between us and the other person. We must look at one another through the common window of the work. We must be related through the common valuation of the work, quite practically through working on ourselves. When two people in the work quarrel, they have a great deal of work to do. They may not be ready for it, in which case sore places will be made, just as in life. They may refuse to work on themselves, or in connection with one another. They then will both internally consider, both think they are owed, both think that the other should apologize first. Of course, if we do not work on ourselves, just live and do nothing extra, the work cannot become third force for us. Third force is relating force. In this case, life will be third force, and life divides, whereas the work should unite. Life divides because in life people do not understand one another. They have no common basis, no common language. However, in the work there is a common basis, where people can begin to speak a common language and so understand one another. 10 times more external considering is necessary in the work than in life, and of quite a different quality, because the work is the relating force. If two people in the work quarrel, and are ready to work, then desire to do so, both of them will do so from themselves, not by meeting and talking it over, but simply as part of the work itself. Each will put themselves in the other's position, and each see themselves from the other person's viewpoint. External considering is very good work. It is not about whether you were right or the other person wrong. It increases consciousness by including the first and the second lines of work on oneself and working with others. If we base our existence on internal considering, then we will end our lives as most people do. Our lives then are all one-sided, undealt with, undigested, so many unhappy things just left lying about and festering in the past, so many violent or bitter feelings, so many places to which one has become bogged down through past identifying. All of this is certainly due to not giving oneself the first conscious shock, to not letting life fall on the work in us. We can see so often how internal considering has spoiled life, and what a terrible form of identifying it is, because it really is like looking at life the wrong way around. People who can only internally consider, and feel that others should be different, take hold of one another so wrongly that they accumulate between themselves a mass of heavy, dense, negative material to which they become fastened, and which they will not surrender. External considering, however, is utterly different. It cleanses and liberates us. It joins together what is missing, by making us see the other side of the street, and realize the effect of what we do. We begin to understand outcomes, what cancels all the feelings of indebtedness by bringing together the debit and the credit sides of our accounts. We can begin to grasp the difference between karma and outcomes. An hour of external considering will free us from the effects of weeks of internal considering. Because the more we can see ourselves through observation, in the moment, the more we can see the kind of person that we have been all our lives, the more we will be able to externally consider correctly. Remember, however, that external considering can only begin in its practical application, with putting ourselves in the other person's place, looking out as it were of the other person's mind, and conscious of ourselves as they see us. Do not think that external considering is altruism, and doing something for another person. As long as we externally consider another person, with a view to trying to change them, as long as we think that the other person should be different, we are not externally considering, but internally considering. The basis of internal considering is thinking that others should be different, and from this comes making accounts against others. It is necessary to understand the point clearly. If we feel another person should not treat us as they do, should not annoy us, or should not be such as they are, could we then be making demands or not? Of course we are. In real external considering, we cannot start from this point, because we are starting from the idea that we are right and they are wrong. Then because we think that we are right and indebted, we feel that they owe us something. In what sense do they owe us anything? We feel they should align with our ideas, and because they do not, we feel that something is lacking which they should be doing. We feel that they owe us tribute, or right behavior, according to our private standards of what is right and wrong. We see that all this means that we are putting ourselves in the position of both judge and jury. We are judging the other person from our own acquired ideals of what that person ought to be like. This is a source of internal considering with regard to that side called making accounts. In short, we feel the other person owes us. However, if we start instead by trying to externally consider another, from the basis of internal considering, from the basis of thinking the other person should be different, then our external considering will amount to nothing but internal considering. We are making no attempt to start from the right basis of external considering, which is putting ourselves in the other person's situation. On the contrary, we are starting from our own situation, and not from the other person's. In comparison with real external considering, this is nothing but a form of hypocrisy, and we will probably end shrugging our shoulders, rolling our eyes and saying, "Well, I have done my best for this person, and I cannot do more." In so doing, we wash our hands of them in our own feelings of merit, self-righteousness, and virtue. External considering in the work sense is nothing like this. Take an ordinary mechanical individual, who is an everyday person. They are full of buffers, prejudices, negative attitudes, pictures of themselves, vanity, stereotypical gramophone records, and so on. Suppose they attempt, such as they find themselves, to externally consider, really to put themselves in another person's life, into their situation, and into their mind. Do you think they will be able to do so? Of course not, because quite simply they do not see themselves, so how could they see the other person? And if they do not see the other person, how can they put themselves in the other person's position? That is why it is said that before you can begin to externally consider in any real way, you should have reached some degree of self-observation, and it is only according to your degree of self-observation and self-knowledge that you can externally consider another person. In so far as you know yourself, you will know aright the other person. In so far as you can see yourself, you can see others rightly. Do each of us realize how tiresome, how difficult, how unpleasant, how prejudiced and how exacting we can be? Have you noticed this in yourself? If so, then you are in a better position to externally consider other people, for when you see their faults, you will also see your own faults. But such as we are made, looking out from our five senses and not looking in at ourselves, we only see other people's faults, then to balance the account takes a lifetime of work and insight. We all have pictures of ourselves, we are all in one way or another smug. The dictionary definition of smug is derived from a German word meaning to dress up, smock, smuggle, and therefore, to be scrupulous in keeping up the appearance of respectability, to be absurdly self-satisfied and complacent. One thing is quite certain, and that is the more sincerely we observe ourselves and what is in us, the less smug we should be. And from this it follows that we shall be less satisfied to think that we know what the other person should be like. So we judge less, and in consequence are able to put ourselves in another person's position more easily. Recall the two examples of praying in the Gospels, one who prayed thanking God that they were not as others, and the one that beat their breast, saying they were a sinner. Which of these two do you think would best be able to externally consider? And which of those two would you rather be judged by? There is a saying in the work that has been mentioned more than once, that unless one begins to realize their own nothingness, they cannot do this work. They will not jump to catch the rope let down from above to save them. However, all this takes time, and we must take the work, stage by stage, in our gradual understanding of it. No one can outstrip themselves, their own level of being. As being changes, so does understanding alter. External considering is work on being as noted. Our being is roughly how we take things. In life, people do not really externally consider one another, because of their level of being. If people really externally considered one another, then war would be impossible. But war is possible because of humanity's level of being, which is such that only internally considering, making accounts, thirsting for revenge, and so on is understood. We can understand then that to externally consider in the work sense, is to take a step beyond our ordinary level of being. Or to put it in another way, if we can really externally consider, our level of being will become different. All external considering in the work sense requires effort, whereas all internal considering is easy, mechanical, and self-indulgent. The taste of the two is quite different. A conscious effort has quite a different taste from a mechanical, automatic reaction. To be offended is extremely easy. It's a mechanical reaction. Not to be offended, or to transform being offended, is difficult. It requires conscious effort. It requires a lot of thought, a lot of inner adjustment, a lot of remembering what one is like oneself, and so on, to transform the first impact of being offended. That is real work on oneself. Do you wish to belong to the terrific chain of cause and effect which makes up mechanical humanity, or would you prefer to get out of it? If you do, then you must work on your mechanical reactions. If you follow the law of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, kick me and I will chop your foot off, then you will always remain in the circle of mechanical humanity which leads nowhere. Esotericism brings a new law, the law of non-identifying, the law of self-observation, through practice, the application of work itself to daily life. This work is esoteric Christianity and esoteric Buddhism, where Christ and the Buddha both said, "I bring you a new law." The work says the same thing. This work brings new laws for behavior, both inner and outer. If we can make it our aim to externally consider a person in the work or in life, then we should practice external considering in the work, because it is easier if the other person is working also, but if this is not possible, or not so easily done for the time being, then we must do the same in everyday life, as a householder. Life can become our teacher. It becomes our teacher as soon as we begin to work from ourselves, from a genuine desire to work, which means an evaluation of the work. Remember, the work can become cold and distant if we do not keep it alive, and we will not keep it alive if we do not love it. To externally consider a person in life is just the same as in the work, only we will not be helped by the other person necessarily, and so it will be very easy for our attempts at external considering to turn into an increased form of internal considering. We must calculate second force, and factor in the difficulties. It will be useless, of course, if we start off from a superior position, and try instead to set the other person right. Remember that when you feel offended, you are beginning to internally consider. You must be quite passive to the other person's irritation, and work on yourself all the time. If you can do this, then do so and do not get offended. If you are sincere in your aim, you may be able to carry it out. You must never find fault, or show that you are finding fault. You must be ready to bear false accusations, and of course you must be ready to bear the unpleasant manifestations of the other person, but do not lose your temper or begin to chant, "Here am I doing my best to be nice," and so on. Once this begins, then it means you are internally considering. And if you do that, then you are starting from a very shallow basis, not from a real, matured aim. Externally considering a person in life means that we must change ourselves. We must already have some idea of what it means to be all things to all people. We must be able to eat and drink, to joke and listen or talk without any trace of the work being behind us. We may have an opportunity to say something, and we may not. That doesn't matter. A person in the fourth way of work must be able to be quite ordinary in life. There must be no kind of superiority, no hinting, no persuasion and no dark remarks. If we work on ourselves, while the other person is being difficult, that will make the other person aware that we are different. But we cannot show this openly. When life becomes one's teacher, then the highest work is reached, and we are right in the track of the fourth way. But it is difficult, and requires much extensive work on oneself, to be patient and understanding. We must, as it were, be able to suffer all things at the hands of others, and yet keep on working in spite of this. If you externally consider a person in life, feel superior and so feeling a constant judgment, if you show this openly, then you are not working. That is not the path of the fourth way. To become passive in a work sense to another person requires great inner work, particularly so to a person in everyday life. In some ways, it is easier than becoming passive to a person in the work. However, we must realize what is meant for us through experience. You know how in life people are always trying to improve one another, by reproving one another, always finding fault with one another. This is quite useless and leads to all the endless strife in life. Making oneself passive to a person, then working on oneself therefrom is the solution, because to be passive requires constant inner work on ourselves, which can effect a change in the other person, because our work makes room for them to alter. If we, however, react mechanically all the time, it leaves no room for the other person to turn about and change. By not reacting, we leave room. With regard to externally considering a person in life, remember that we must really aim at doing this. We must ask ourselves whether we really want to, or not. We must have a genuinely matured conscious aim that starts in the light of the work, and to which we hold on every time we remember ourselves, every time we think of what we are doing practically in the work. Only then will the work help us. If the basis of our aim, however, is only a life one, then it will not conduct the force of the work. It may be easier to work from a life aim. We are told to make friends of the mammon of unrighteousness. In real relationship, in the work, this is not enough. It is indeed far from enough. But in externally considering a person in life, what belongs to life aim can enter, if it helps our work aim. Take as an example, if you fear to lose some job, some position, and so on, your life aim may help your work aim to be passive to unpleasant manifestations. This is allowed. But we must know which is which, and when genuine work comes in, then realize what we are doing, and what life considerations make us do. A different example is when a person may be so placed that their contact with the work depends upon their external consideration of people in life. This can be done, only it requires intelligence, and remaining passive to criticism. It particularly requires the capacity of inner silence. Wrong talking will of course create difficulties. That is, a person in this work surrounded by people in life who have no magnetic center, must behave in an ordinary way. They must be silent, not in an obvious or intriguing way, but really internally silent, so that others notice nothing unusual. Being a silent Buddha will be part of their work. Their other work will consist of not reacting mechanically, as they always did. We are speaking of those in the work who are connected by ties with people not in the work. Now we can speak of those in the work who wish for a special reason to make relationship with those not in the work. The whole question then surrounds magnetic center. If you feel the work emotionally, you will find it difficult to make contact with those who cannot feel it. After some conversation, you will probably notice that a line of separation appears. Do not blame the work for this fact. The work guides you to certain people, or not. One has to listen to the work as it were, as best one can. You must also remember that the difference between a person who knows something of this work, and a person who does not, is considerable. In fact, a gulf lies between them. Socially you may like someone and be attracted to them, then wish to bring them into this work, but if there is no magnetic center, and the whole quality of conversation is limited to life, then you will feel that there is, as is actually the case, a gulf. There are very nice people in life who cannot enter the work. And this is as it should be. We can only meet through a common understanding, not through external appearances, or physical attraction. Try then to grasp and accept this. A person who is beginning to understand the work will find it difficult to unite with one who has no magnetic center. Remember that the possession of magnetic center is a sign of level of being. Some have it, without knowing they have it. But in general people of different levels of being do not unite. These are the laws of Manu. How can they understand that magnetic center is a very big thing with regard to the sign of a person's being? A person may be clever, or a good scientist and so on, but have no sense of anything higher, no feeling of greater mind. Someone in the highest position of life does not necessarily possess magnetic center and usually does not. Life is not a standard for estimating a person in work valuation, save with regard to being a good householder. Neither Herod nor Pilate was fit for the esoteric teachings of the Christ. All that is obvious enough, and yet Mary Magdalene was a true and faithful disciple. Life values and work values are quite different. A big man in life is not a big man in the work. You cannot talk to a highly successful individual in life of this work, thinking that they will understand you. We must never think that high position in life or beauty and attraction, physical attributes, or a radiant disposition mean a high understanding of this work. In fact, as often as not, the case is quite the contrary. This idea takes a long time to sink into people. We can add one last observation, which is of the greatest importance to external considering. One cannot externally consider another person, unless we are able to break him or her up into different eyes. And we cannot do this unless we can see different eyes in ourselves. If we always think of ourselves as one eye, then we will also always think of others as having one single permanent eye. Can you yet think of different eyes in yourself, and not say I to everything in you? Then you will in the same degree be able to see different eyes in another person. You will see their good and their bad eyes, which will help you to externally consider the other.